Teacher tried to embarrass black student with impossible math, but he turned the whole classroom upside down. What if I told you a teacher used math to humiliate a student not because he failed, but because he was too brilliant? What if I told you the quiet black boy everyone overlooked solved a problem meant to break him and shattered an entire system instead? This isn't just a story about school. It's about how racism hides behind chalkboards, how genius can live in silence, and what happens when the person they tried to silence decides to speak with numbers that no one can ignore. Buckle up, because what happened in room 302 didn't just change one life, it changed the rules. They thought he was the quiet kid, the one who never raised his hand. So when the teacher called him to the board and gave him the hardest question in the book, everyone expected him to choke. What they didn't know was that Jalen Brooks had been solving harder problems his whole life. And today he wasn't just solving an equation, he was rewriting the rules. Dear viewer, don't miss this powerful story about hidden talent and justice. And if this is your first time watching one of my videos, I humbly ask you to comment where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story published daily. Thank you. And now let's dive into the full story. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Roosevelt Middle School, casting long shadows across the dusty chalkboards and faded motivational posters. The clock ticked toward 9:03 when Jalen Brooks pushed open the classroom door, backpack slung over one shoulder, his hoodie slightly damp from the morning rain. He moved with a careful tension in his limbs, each step deliberate, each breath slow, as if preparing for impact. Inside, the room had already settled into its usual uneasy silence. At the front stood Ms. Meredith Shaw, tall, precise, always in heels. Her sharp voice had a reputation, and so did her eyes. Narrow, calculating, always waiting for someone to misstep. Jalen had learned to be invisible in her class, a skill he'd perfected over the years. He was good at math, brilliant even, but he'd stopped raising his hand months ago. Some teachers don't reward brilliance when it comes from the wrong person. "You're late again, Brooks!" Ms. Shaw's voice snapped like a whip the moment he stepped inside. Heads turned. The room went still. Jalen mumbled an apology, avoiding her gaze. His lower back throbbed, still sore from when he had been forced to sit in a broken chair the week prior. But he didn't complain. Complaints didn't end well in Ms. Shaw's classroom. "Take your seat," she said sharply, pointing toward the back row. "Or are you going to start today with another performance?" Jalen hesitated. Standing was easier than bending onto the warped seat that bit into his spine like a rusted jaw. "If it's all right, ma'am, I'd rather stand for now, just for today." Her lips curled upward into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You'd rather stand? How generous of you to decide how the classroom works. Tell me, Brooks, since you're so special, perhaps you'd like to teach the lesson too." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the room. Jalen lowered his eyes. "No, ma'am." Ms. Shaw turned to the whiteboard, erasing the simple algebra problem she'd written for the day's exercise. "You know," she said, her voice cool and deliberate, "there's something I give to students who think they're too smart to follow the rules." She began to write, and what she wrote wasn't simple. The symbols that spread across the board were unfamiliar to most of the 8th graders in the room. Integrals, limits, and notations borrowed from high school calculus. She capped the marker with a snap and stepped aside with the theatrical flair of someone staging a lesson in humiliation. "This," she announced with exaggerated sweetness, "is a real challenge, a problem for 11th grade AP students. Let's see if Mr. Brooks, who apparently writes his own rules, can solve it." The class fell into stunned silence. A few students turned around, eyes wide. Jalen stood frozen, unsure if this was a test or a trap. "You have 5 minutes," Ms. Shaw said, checking her watch. "Impress us or enjoy the week's worth of detention that comes with refusing to participate." Jalen stared at the board. At first, it looked foreign, then familiar bits and pieces he recognized from the hours he'd spent after school in the public library. He'd found old college textbooks there months ago, forgotten on the shelves, dog-eared and dusty. No one had shown him how to read them, but he'd figured it out quietly, privately, in a world where numbers made more sense than people ever did. He walked slowly to the board, picked up the marker, and began. The room held its breath. At first, a few students chuckled nervously. "He's actually going to try," someone whispered. But as Jalen's hand moved across the board, confident, steady, the laughter died. He broke the equation into parts, substituting variables, solving integrals, aligning terms, drawing each symbol with purposeful clarity. His hand trembled slightly, but his logic didn't. Ms. Shaw's smile faded. 3 minutes passed, then 4. Jalen stepped back and set the marker down. "Done," he said, barely above a whisper. The silence was deafening. Ms. Shaw walked up to the board heels, clicking against tile like gavel strikes. She studied his solution, eyes darting from line to line, her brows furrowed, her lips tightened. The answer was correct, perfect even. But that couldn't be, could it? She turned to face him. "Where did you learn this?" "I just learned it," Jalen replied. "Don't lie to me," she hissed. "You don't even belong in this classroom most days. This is impossible." "I didn't cheat," he said louder this time. Ms. Shaw's voice turned cold. "Enough. You think this is a game, a trick to embarrass me? Do you think I don't know what this is?" She grabbed a nearby rag and wiped the board clean, erasing every symbol, every answer, every trace of what had just happened. Then she pointed to the door. "Principal's office. Now!" Jalen turned, heart-pounding, and walked away from the board, his face-burning fists clenched. Behind him, Ms. Shaw muttered to the class, "There's no way he did that on his own." But a few of the students weren't so sure. One girl in the front row leaned over to the boy next to her. "I think he really solved it." The boy shrugged, eyes still wide. "I think we all just saw something we weren't supposed to see." What none of them knew, what even Jalen himself didn't fully grasp yet, was that this moment meant to shame him would set something far greater in motion. It was the first crack in a wall that had held him back for years. The beginning of something he couldn't have imagined, because sometimes a challenge meant to humiliate is exactly what reveals the truth, and the truth doesn't stay hidden for long. Jalen sat outside Principal Victor Aldridge's office, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead, the rough texture of the hallway bench pressed into the backs of his legs. His fingers fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve, his mind racing not from guilt but from disbelief. Not even 10 minutes ago he had done something no one had expected, something he wasn't supposed to be able to do. And now, instead of recognition, he was being punished. The double doors swung open. Ms. Meredith Shaw emerged, her expression tight and unreadable. She gave Jalen one last glance, not of surprise, not even curiosity, but of quiet fury, before striding down the hall. "Jalen Brooks," a calm voice called from inside the office. He stood and stepped in. Principal Aldridge was a tall man with graying temples, his office lined with plaques and framed photographs from school events. He looked up from a notepad and gestured to the seat across from him. "Have a seat." Jalen sat stiffly, not speaking. Principal Aldridge folded his hands. "Ms. Shaw tells me you caused a disruption in her classroom. She also says you attempted to solve an advanced calculus problem, one not appropriate for your level." He paused. "She seems convinced the only way you could have done it was by cheating." Jalen opened his mouth, but no words came. He wasn't afraid. He was tired. "I didn't cheat," he finally said. His voice was steady, unshaken by the fear most students would have felt in that moment. Principal Aldridge stared at him for a few seconds longer, then leaned back. "I believe you," he said quietly. Jalen blinked. He wasn't expecting that. But the question is, how Jalen hesitated. Then he told him, He talked about the library down the street from his apartment, the one where he'd go after school instead of heading home right away. He described how he'd stumbled upon an old calculus textbook in the donation bin and decided on a whim to start reading. How the numbers made sense in a way nothing else in the world did. How he'd been teaching himself bit by bit using videos and forums, slipping through pages the way other kids scrolled through TikToks. It just made sense, Jalen said softly. I didn't tell anyone because, well, who would believe me? Principal Aldridge didn't speak right away. He simply leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying the boy in front of him. Finally, he stood. Jalen, I want you to wait here, he said. There's someone I want to bring in. 10 minutes later, a second voice entered the room. Warmer, lighter. So this is the young man I've heard about. It was Ms. Liana Harper, the school's guidance counselor. A black woman in her late 40s known for her calm presence and the sunflower pin she wore every day on her blazer. She had a reputation for noticing things other teachers didn't. Jalen, she said, sitting down across from him, I read over your academic file this morning. Your grades are good, but they don't tell me the whole story, do they? He shook his head. I don't think they ever have. Her eyes softened. Sometimes brilliance doesn't look the way the system expects it to. Sometimes it hides where no one's looking because it's afraid of being torn down before it ever has a chance to grow. She pulled out a sheet of paper. This is the problem Ms. Shaw gave you. He looked at it. It was the same. The one he had just solved an hour ago. I sent it to someone I trust, Professor Aisha Caldwell. She teaches advanced mathematics at the University of Chicago. I emailed her a picture of your solution without telling her who wrote it. Jalen's heart skipped. She wrote back, Ms. Harper continued. And she told me this was not only the correct answer, but that it showed a level of creative problem-solving she rarely sees even in her undergraduate students. Jalen's eyes widened. His breath caught in his throat. She said that he asked. She did, Ms. Harper confirmed. And now we need to start asking the right questions. Not about what you did wrong, but about what this school needs to do to support a student like you. She leaned forward. Jalen, have you ever heard of the National Young Scholars Initiative? He shook his head. It's a program that identifies gifted students from underrepresented communities. They offer weekend workshops, summer intensives, even early college credit. I think you'd be a perfect fit. Jalen blinked, unsure how to respond. But before any of that, she continued, her voice growing firm. We need to address what happened in that classroom. What Ms. Shaw did. How she tried to humiliate you in front of your peers. That's not okay. She looked at Principal Aldridge, who nodded slowly. We'll be having a formal conversation with her, he said. And we're going to open a broader investigation, not just into how you were treated, but into how many other students like you might be slipping through the cracks. Jalen sat in silence, stunned. He had walked into this office expecting detention, maybe suspension. Instead, he was being offered something he had never received before. Belief, validation, hope. As Ms. Harper left the room, she turned to Jalen with a quiet smile. You don't have to stay small just because someone else was afraid of your light. That night, Jalen couldn't sleep. His mind buzzed with possibilities. He opened the textbook he'd hidden under his mattress and ran his fingers along the page. For the first time, he let himself imagine what it might feel like to solve equations in a room full of people who expected him to be there. Not just because he could, but because he belonged. The next morning at Lincoln Middle School began like any other. The halls buzzed with casual chatter sneakers squeaking across waxed linoleum floors, lockers clanking open and shut in their usual rhythm. But for Jalen Brooks, everything felt different. He walked through the front doors not with fear, not this time, but with a rising heat in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite resolve, something in between. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind like an echo. The problem, the humiliation, the solution. And then the most unexpected of all, validation. He wasn't imagining his gift. He wasn't crazy for thinking he saw patterns where others didn't. And he certainly wasn't wrong for refusing to let someone shrink him into silence. Still, he knew what was waiting. Word had spread quickly. As he made his way toward homeroom, he felt the eyes on him. Some curious, some wide with wonder, a few still skeptical, a few resentful. Whispers trailed him like shadows. Is that the kid who solved the college math problem? Nah, it had to be a fluke. I heard they're making him take some genius test. Ms. Shaw's real quiet today, huh? He passed a cluster of students near the science wing who parted wordlessly to let him through. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. But being seen wasn't as simple as he'd imagined. Visibility was a spotlight, and it was hot. During third period, Ms. Liana Harper pulled him from class and led him to a quiet conference room on the second floor. Waiting inside was a man Jalen had never seen before. Tall, sharply dressed in a gray blazer with kind but watchful eyes. Jalen, this is Dr. Terrence Blake, Ms. Harper said, gesturing toward the man. He's from the National Young Scholars Initiative I told you about. He came in person to meet you. Jalen's heart thumped. Hi, sir, he said, trying to steady his voice. Dr. Blake stood and extended his hand. It's a pleasure, Jalen. I've read your work. And your story. Let's just say you've made quite an impression. Jalen sat down cautiously. He still wasn't used to being talked to like he mattered. Dr. Blake opened a portfolio and pulled out a crisp sheet of paper. What you did in Ms. Shaw's class, that wasn't just solving an equation. That was breaking one. He paused, letting the words settle. For decades, he continued, people have assumed brilliance looks a certain way, acts a certain way, comes from a certain zip code. He leaned in slightly. But what you did, it disrupted that. It forced people to confront their assumptions about intelligence, about race, about who belongs in what classroom. Jalen looked down, uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to start anything, I just didn't want to be made fun of. Dr. Blake's tone softened. That's the thing about revolutions, Jalen. They rarely start with people trying to be brave. They start with people trying to survive. He handed Jalen the paper. It was an application to attend a 3-week summer residency at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, fully sponsored. Housing, travel, meals, all covered. You don't have to decide today, Dr. Blake said. But you deserve to be in rooms where your mind is challenged, not dismissed. Where you're surrounded by others who see you not for what you lack, but for what you carry. Jalen blinked hard. He wasn't used to being offered possibilities. Only punishment. Before they left, Ms. Harper placed a hand on his shoulder. There's more, she said quietly. Principal Aldridge has officially opened an investigation into Ms. Shaw's behavior, and you're not the only student who's come forward. Jalen's head snapped up. I'm not. Ms. Harper shook her head. You lit a fire. Other students are starting to speak about the way they've been treated, about the assumptions made about them. You didn't just change your own path, Jalen, you cracked something open. Later that day, in the crowded cafeteria, Jalen felt something strange begin to shift. A few kids nodded at him in quiet solidarity. One girl from homeroom slipped him a folded note that simply read, "Thanks for standing up." I've been scared too. Even Cole Masters, the class clown who had once mimicked his stutter in front of the whole room, walked over to his table. You really solved that thing, Cole asked, hands shoved deep in his hoodie pockets. Jalen gave a cautious nod. Cole looked down, then back up. That's wild, man. I didn't think you were, smart. Jalen raised one eyebrow. You didn't? Cole winced. Yeah, sorry, dude. I guess I didn't really know you. Jalen looked him in the eye. No, you didn't. He didn't say it with bitterness, just truth. And Cole, to his credit, nodded once and walked away. After school, Jalen met with Dr. Blake and Ms. Harper again. They talked about his options, about scholarships, competitions, mentorship. Dr. Blake even offered to pair him with a black PhD candidate from MIT who could mentor him virtually until the summer. But the most important part came at the end. Jalen, Dr. Blake said, "You have a gift. That's clear. But you also have a responsibility, not just to yourself, but to the kids watching you, the ones who haven't found their voice yet." Jalen shifted in his chair. "I didn't ask for that," he said instinctively. "None of us do," Dr. Blake replied. "But that doesn't mean it's not yours." That night, Jalen sat in his room with the application open on his desk. He glanced at the violin his dad used to play, now collecting dust in the corner. He thought about his mom, always working, always tired, but always there. He thought about Ms. Shaw's scowl when he finished the equation. He thought about the library, the pages, the peace that came when the numbers lined up and made sense. And for the first time in his life, Jalen allowed himself to believe he wasn't just solving equations. He was rewriting the rules. On the morning of the school board hearing, the parking lot at Lincoln Middle was already full. Community members arrived in clusters, parents with tightly folded arms, teachers whispering under their breath, students craning their necks to see what all the fuss was about. Some carried handmade signs, "Accountability, not silence. Protect our kids, not your pride." Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation and quiet fury. Jalen Brooks sat with his mother, Mrs. Rochelle Brooks, and Dr. Terrence Blake in the second row of the auditorium. The district's makeshift town hall was now transformed into the stage for a reckoning. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The crowd hushed. A row of school board members took their seats behind a long oak table, their faces tight with the kind of practiced neutrality only politics could teach. Then Principal Victor Aldridge stepped to the microphone. His voice, usually measured and rehearsed, carried a sharpened edge, now the edge of conscience awakened. "We are gathered today to address multiple complaints of misconduct against Ms. Meredith Shaw, mathematics teacher at Lincoln Middle," he began. "These allegations include misuse of authority, inappropriate disciplinary action, and a pattern of bias toward minority students." He paused, looking slowly around the room. "We are also here to evaluate the system that enabled it." A murmur rolled through the crowd like a low wave. Some gasped, some nodded, others clenched their jaws. Jalen's stomach twisted as Ms. Shaw entered from the back, her once confident stride now tight and stiff. She wore a gray skirt suit and a look of fragile defiance. Her eyes scanned the room until they met his, but this time she didn't look angry. She looked lost. Dr. Blake leaned toward Jalen and whispered, "This is what it looks like when a system realizes it's being watched." The first to speak during the open testimony was a girl named Autumn James, a soft-spoken student who rarely raised her hand in class. She stepped to the mic, voice trembling but clear. "Ms. Shaw called me lazy when I didn't finish a timed quiz," she said. "But I have dyslexia." She knew that. She told me I just needed to try harder. Silence. Then came Tariq Bennett. "She told me I'd never pass algebra because some kids just aren't wired for logic," he said, his voice low but firm. After that, I stopped raising my hand altogether. A mother followed, then a community organizer, then a therapist who worked with at-risk youth in the district. One by one, they painted a picture not just of a teacher, but of a culture. A system that punished quiet brilliance, that confused compliance with potential, that mistook difference for defiance. Each testimony was a crack in a dam that had held too long. Then it was Jalen's turn. His legs shook as he approached the mic. He could feel every eye in the auditorium settle on him, some watching with curiosity, some with hope, others with judgment. He took a breath, looked down, then up. "I didn't ask to be treated special," he began. "I just didn't want to be treated less." A pause, his voice steadier now. "When I solved that problem, Ms. Shaw didn't praise me. She accused me. She erased my work. She tried to erase me. A ripple of emotion passed through the audience. And it wasn't the first time. I've seen it happen to others, not always loud, not always cruel, but always with the same message, know your place. He turned and looked directly at the board. But what happens when our place is somewhere bigger than you expected? What do you do then? Shrink us down, or help us grow into it? A long silence followed, not because his words fell flat, but because they landed with the weight of truth. The kind of truth that demands stillness. No one clapped, no one needed to. The silence was louder than applause. After a brief recess, the board reconvened to deliver their decision. Board President Naomi Ellington, composed but visibly moved, cleared her throat. The board finds sufficient evidence of repeated misconduct and inappropriate disciplinary measures by Ms. Meredith Shaw, she stated. Effective immediately, she is placed on indefinite administrative leave pending state investigation. A soft gasp rose from the room somewhere between relief and disbelief. But let this be clear, she continued, her voice rising now. This is not just about one teacher. This is about every assumption, every quiet bias that has shaped how we educate and evaluate our students. She looked out into the crowd. Moving forward, this district will implement a full review of bias training, disciplinary policies, and academic tracking programs. Every child deserves to be seen fully, fairly, and with the expectation of greatness. Ms. Shaw stood motionless. Her career, once untouchable, was now a cautionary tale. Later that afternoon, Jalen walked the hallway of Lincoln Middle with a strange mixture of pride and unease. Some students high-fived him, others simply nodded silently with a respect he wasn't used to. But what struck him most were the ones who lingered near him without saying a word, as if proximity to courage might awaken their own. In Ms. Shaw's now vacant classroom, a substitute teacher smiled warmly from the desk. We'll be learning in a new way, she said. One where everyone participates, one where your questions matter. Jalen felt something loosen in his chest. After school, he returned to his usual spot in the library, not to hide anymore, but to work. A new math notebook in front of him. A problem from Dr. Blake's latest assignment open. He scribbled the first few lines of an equation and smiled. Outside, the system had blinked. Inside, something brighter had opened, not just for him, but for everyone still waiting to be seen. The world didn't transform overnight. Systems never do. But sometimes, they shift just enough for the light to get in. And for Jalen Brooks, everything had changed, even if the hallways of Lincoln Middle still looked the same. In the weeks that followed the board's decision, a quiet energy spread through the school. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was real. A new kind of attentiveness had taken root, teachers second-guessing their assumptions, students stepping forward in small but powerful ways, and conversations once whispered now happening in the open. For the first time in a long while, Jalen felt that the air in school didn't just press down on him. It carried him forward. He now split his mornings between Lincoln Middle and nearby Madison High School, where he attended advanced math courses with students 3 years older. His presence there was met with curiosity at first, a middle schooler in high school halls, another outsider. But Jalen let his work speak, and when it did, classmates began to lean in instead of turning away. One morning after class, Mr. Devin Clark, the high school calculus teacher, pulled him aside. "You've got something rare," he said, holding up Jalen's assignment. "Most kids learn math. You feel it." Jalen smiled, not because he needed the praise, but because it echoed something he was starting to believe about himself. For years, he had hidden in the shadows of potential, afraid to be seen. Now, the very thing that once exposed him to humiliation had become his most powerful truth. But Jalen's growth didn't stop at numbers. One Friday afternoon, as golden light filtered through the windows of Lincoln's library, he met with a group of 6th and 7th graders who had asked for help with their homework. What began as simple tutoring soon evolved into something more. They came with math questions, but stayed for the way Jalen explained things, patient, thoughtful. always finding the words that made even the hardest ideas feel possible. He wasn't just solving problems anymore. He was helping others believe they could too. From a distance, Ms. Harper often watched with a quiet smile. She had seen firsthand how trauma could silence brilliance and how empowerment could release it. "Jalen," she told him one afternoon, "you didn't just change your story. You rewrote the script for how we see kids like you." He wasn't sure what to say to that. So instead, he wrote it down later in his journal in the same precise handwriting he used for equations. Sometimes you don't need to be loud to make a sound that echoes. There were still difficult days. Change, even when it begins, takes time to take root. Some teachers resisted. Some students still sneered. And Ms. Shaw's name remained a wound not everyone knew how to talk about. But Jalen wasn't afraid of those moments anymore. He understood now every system is just a sum of the people inside it. And every person, when seen, heard, and believed, could become the variable that makes the impossible solvable. One afternoon, Dr. Blake took him to visit the State University's campus. They sat on a bench near the math building watching students move between classes. Dr. Blake handed Jalen a pamphlet for a summer institute for gifted youth. "You should apply," he said. "I've already written your recommendation. But this time, I want you to tell your story in the application." Jalen hesitated. "The whole story." "As much as you're ready to share," Dr. Blake replied gently. "Because the world doesn't just need your brain, Jalen. It needs your voice." Jalen looked out at the sea of students ahead of him and realized he wasn't dreaming of escaping anymore. He was building toward something. And the equation that had once been used to reduce him to a joke had become something entirely new, a formula for resistance, a formula for connection, a formula for hope. Later that night, as he sat at his kitchen table with the application in front of him, Jalen picked up his pen. He began not with numbers, but with truth. "My name is Jalen Brooks. I used to believe I was the quiet kid who had to stay out of the way. But then someone tried to use my gift against me, and I discovered it was my gift that could set me free." He paused. Then he kept writing. Because this time, he wasn't solving someone else's equation. He was writing his own. In a world where too many voices go unheard and too many gifts are buried under bias, Jalen's story is a reminder brilliance doesn't always raise its hand. Sometimes it waits quietly until someone tries to silence it, and then it roars. What happened in that classroom wasn't just about a math problem. It was about permission. Permission to be seen, to be different, to be brilliant in your own way even when no one expects it, especially when no one expects it. At Soulful Stories II, we believe stories like this don't just entertain, they wake us up. They remind us that the quietest student might be carrying the loudest truth, that every child deserves not just a seat in the classroom, but a chance to belong at the board. So now we ask you, have you ever been underestimated because of how you look, where you're from, or how you speak? Do you believe schools are lifting up every student, or just the ones who fit the mold? And here's the question no one wants to answer. If Jalen had been white, would this story have ended the same way? If this story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of someone you love, please don't scroll away. Hit the like button. Leave a comment sharing where you're watching from or who this story made you think of, and subscribe to Soulful Stories 4 for more real, raw, and radical stories that deserve to be heard. Because silence never changed the world, but you still can.